The prison gates closed behind him 20 years ago with them and his family's future. While he rotted in a cell, his name was erased, his wife broken, his children scattered. The people who framed him went on with their lives, richer, safer, smiling. But time didn't soften him. It sharpened him. Tonight, he's back. And every debt they thought was buried is about to be collected. The bus stopped with a tired hiss of air at the edge of the city. Not inside it, not where anything important happened, but where dust collected and people passed through without being seen. He stepped down slowly, carrying a small plastic bag that held everything the state had decided he deserved after 20 years. The morning light was pale and careful, as if it did not want to touch him too directly, and the air smelled of hot asphalt and old rain. No one was waiting. No name was called. No door opened. He stood for a moment, letting the noise of engines and distant horns settle around him. And then he walked out. His name was Daniel, though the city no longer remembered it. On paper, it existed in files that were locked and forgotten. In the mouths of those who had spoken it once, it had been replaced by safer words. He walked with the calm of a man who had learned how to move without drawing attention. His shoulders relaxed, his face empty of requests. He wore a shirt that did not quite fit and shoes that had been repaired too many times. And yet there was nothing weak about him. He had learned patience in a place where patience was the only form of control. And it showed in the way he crossed the road, waited for a signal, and did not rush, even when the traffic opened a narrow gap. The city had changed, but not enough to confuse him. Buildings had grown taller and brighter, and glass had replaced concrete in places that once smelled of sweat and oil. Yet the streets still bent the same way, and the shadows fell where he expected them to fall. He walked past shops that sold dreams in neat packages, past people who looked at their phones as if the world inside them mattered more than the one around them, and past a billboard that smiled down with a promise he did not read. He was not here to be persuaded. He was here to arrive. By midday, he reached a small room above a tailor's shop, a place he had arranged through a man who asked no questions and accepted cash without curiosity. The stairs creaked under his weight, and the door opened with a sound that reminded him of metal scraping stone. Inside, the room was clean and empty, with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a window that looked out onto a wall. He placed his bag on the floor and sat down, breathing evenly, as if he were checking the shape of his own presence. The silence did not bother him. Silence had been his companion for a long time, and he knew how to listen to it without being swallowed. In the afternoon, he left the room and walked again, slower this time, letting his eyes work. He passed a school where children laughed and ran, their voices sharp with freedom, and something moved behind his ribs. Not pain exactly, but pressure, like a door held shut by memory. He did not stop. He passed a cafe where a man sat by the window, counting money with careful fingers, and Daniel noticed the watch on the man's wrist, the way he kept his back to the wall, the way he glanced up every few seconds. Old habits spoke to him in quiet ways, and he listened without reacting. As the sun lowered, he entered a public library, the kind that no longer expected many visitors. The air inside was cool and smelled of paper and dust. He sat at a table near the back, opened a newspaper, and read without hurry. The headlines were loud with other people's troubles, but his eyes moved to the smaller stories, the notices, the names that appeared in connection with companies, charities, and public events. He did not write anything down. He did not mark the page. He simply let the information settle, trusting his mind to hold what mattered. When he left, he nodded to the librarian, who nodded back without interest. That evening, he ate at a roadside place where the food was simple and the owner did not look too closely at faces. He ate slowly, tasting each bite, and drank water instead of beer. At a nearby table, men talked about business and plans, their voices confident and careless. One of them laughed too loudly, and Daniel felt the old instinct to measure distance and exits. But he remained where he was, calm and unremarkable. When he paid, he left the exact amount and walked away. Night settled over the city like a curtain, and lights came on in windows that hid lives he did not need to see. Back in his room, he stood by the window and looked at the blank wall across from him. He closed his eyes and allowed himself one memory, just one, of a woman's voice saying his name the way it used to sound before it became dangerous to say it. He did not let the memory grow. He opened his eyes and returned to the present. To anyone watching, he was nothing more than a man trying to begin again, quiet, careful, and small. There was no anger on his face, no promise in his hands, no sign that the past had followed him back through the gates. The city breathed around him, unaware, and the people who had once decided his fate slept comfortably, believing time had finished its work. Daniel lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, counting his breaths until they slowed and matched the steady rhythm he had practiced for years. Tomorrow, he would take another walk, make another quiet observation, and remain exactly what he appeared to be. For now, he allowed the city to believe in its own safety, because calm was the first gift he intended to give it. Daniel began his second morning before the city fully woke, rising while the light was still uncertain and the streets belonged to cleaners, delivery drivers, and men who did not want to be noticed. He washed his face in cold water, dressed with the same care he had learned inside, and left the room without locking the door twice. Old habits were useful, but only when controlled. Outside, the air carried the promise of heat, and the city stretched slowly, unaware of how closely it was being studied. He walked without a clear destination, choosing streets the way a reader chose lines, following patterns instead of signs. At a corner near the market, he stopped to buy bread and fruit, speaking softly, keeping his eyes lowered. The woman who sold them to him did not ask his name, and he did not offer it. He paid, thanked her, and moved on, blending back into the flow. To anyone watching, he was a man learning how to live again, taking small steps, wasting time. That appearance mattered more than speed. By mid-morning, he reached a neighborhood where the buildings leaned closer together, their paint faded by years of sun and neglect. He entered a small repair shop filled with the smell of oil and metal, where a radio played music too low to distract from thought. Behind the counter stood an older man with heavy hands and sharp eyes, the kind that missed very little. They looked at each other for a long moment, not as strangers, but as men measuring silence. "I need a phone," Daniel said, his voice steady. "Ordinary." The man nodded and reached beneath the counter, producing a simple device, old enough to be ignored by anyone who valued new things. No questions were asked. Cash changed hands. As Daniel turned to leave, the man spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Time doesn't erase everything." Daniel paused, then replied without turning, "No, it only shows what lasts." Outside again, he did not check the phone immediately. He waited until he was seated on a bench near a busy intersection, surrounded by movement and noise. Then he turned it on, watching the screen light up like a small promise. Numbers appeared in his mind without effort, memorized years ago, repeated in the dark until they became part of him. He typed one and waited. The call rang 3 times before a voice answered, cautious and low. "I was told this number might still work," Daniel said. There was a pause, long enough to mean something. Then the voice said, "I wondered when you'd try." They did not speak long. They did not speak clearly. They spoke the way men spoke when they understood the weight of listening ears. When the call ended, Daniel placed the phone in his pocket and stood, the corners of his mouth unchanged. One line had been tested. It had not broken. Over the next days, he repeated the pattern, never rushing, never repeating himself in ways that could be traced. He visited places that remembered him only as a shape, not a story. A bar near the river where he drank water and listened. A gym where he paid for a week and trained without drawing attention, letting his body remember strength without display. A courthouse where he sat in the back and watched lawyers move like actors, repeating old lines, noting who greeted whom, and who avoided eye contact. At night, back in the small room, he spread what little he owned on the bed and arranged it carefully, as if order itself could speak. He wrote nothing down, but he thought deeply, connecting faces to positions, habits to weaknesses. He remembered the men who had stood in suits while his life collapsed, the way they had looked through him instead of at him. He did not allow anger to take control. Anger was loud and wasteful. He allowed clarity instead. One evening, as rain tapped lightly against the window, the phone vibrated. A message appeared, short and careful, offering a meeting without naming a place. Daniel replied with a time. When he arrived, it was to a quiet restaurant with dim lights and no music, the kind where conversations dissolved into the background. The man waiting for him had aged, his hair thinner, his confidence worn smooth by compromise. They shook hands like strangers. "I thought you'd be different," the man said after a while. "I am," Daniel replied. "That's the point." They talked about nothing important until the food arrived. Then, without raising his voice, Daniel asked a single question. The man answered without enthusiasm, as if relieved to finally put something down. When they parted, there was no promise made, only an understanding formed in silence. That was enough. By the end of the week, Daniel had rebuilt something fragile but functional, a network made of memory, caution, and patience. No one piece could be followed back to him. No single move pointed toward a future act. He remained what he appeared to be, a man adjusting to freedom, walking familiar streets, learning new names. And yet, beneath that surface, pieces were aligning with quiet precision. Doors were being tested, not opened. Names were being spoken, not challenged. The city continued to breathe easily, confident in its routines. While Daniel prepared without urgency, knowing that true revenge did not announce itself, it waited. The first crack did not come with noise or confrontation. It arrived quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as coincidence. Daniel understood this better than anyone. Loud revenge satisfied anger, but quiet revenge changed lives without warning. And he wanted the change to sink in slowly. The man's name was Victor Hale. Once, he had been a junior partner in a firm that made its living bending facts into acceptable shapes. Now he owned a consulting company that advised corporations on risk management. A clean phrase that meant knowing who to protect and who to sacrifice. Victor lived in a glass-fronted apartment overlooking the river, drove a car that never stayed dirty for long, and spoke about integrity at conferences where people nodded as if the word still meant something. He was not the worst of them, but he had been the first to look away when it mattered. And that made him perfect. Daniel learned Victor's rhythm before he touched anything connected to him. He watched from places that could not be remembered, noting the mornings Victor left early, the evenings he stayed late, the days he met a woman who was not his wife. Patterns revealed themselves to patient eyes. Victor believed his life was stable, and belief made men careless. On a Tuesday afternoon, Daniel sat in a cafe across the street from Victor's office building, stirring a cup of coffee he did not drink. He wore a jacket that blended with the crowd and read a newspaper already a day old. When Victor exited the building, speaking into his phone with practiced confidence, Daniel did not look up. He counted steps instead. He waited until Victor crossed the street and disappeared into traffic before standing and leaving through the back door. The move itself was simple. No hacking, no threats, no visible interference. Daniel had learned, years ago, that systems failed most often when nudged gently. Victor's company had a minor compliance review scheduled, routine enough to inspire boredom. Daniel made sure that boredom turned into scrutiny. Anonymous tips were sent from places that could not be traced, written in the careful language of insiders who knew how to sound concerned rather than angry. Nothing false was added, nothing exaggerated. Truth, when presented correctly, was more dangerous than lies. Within days, the review expanded. Emails were requested. Old cases resurfaced. Victor laughed it off at first, assuring his staff that this was normal, that nothing would come of it. But Daniel saw the change before Victor did. The way Victor stayed later at the office, the way his phone calls became shorter, more urgent, the way his smile thinned in photographs posted online. One evening, Victor arrived home to find his wife waiting, her tablet open to an article that did not accuse, but questioned. She asked him what it meant. He told her it was nothing. He told her it would pass. He told her the same thing he had told himself years ago when Daniel's life collapsed in a courtroom where Victor sat and remained silent. Daniel did not watch the argument. He did not need to. He walked along the river instead, the water dark and steady beside him, reflecting city lights that trembled with every movement. He felt no rush, no triumph. This was not the point of satisfaction. This was the point of confirmation. The system still worked. The cracks still spread when pressure was applied in the right place. The next step came unexpectedly. Not from Daniel, but from Victor himself. Late one night, the old phone vibrated. A number appeared that Daniel had not given out in years. He answered without greeting. "I know it's you," Victor said, his voice tight, stripped of polish. Daniel remained silent. "I don't know how," Victor continued, "but I know this didn't just happen." Daniel spoke then, softly, evenly. "You always knew more than you admitted." There was a pause, heavy and unstable. "What do you want?" Victor asked. "Nothing," Daniel replied. "This isn't about wanting." Victor exhaled sharply, the sound of a man realizing that negotiation was not an option. "We can fix this," he said. "Whatever it is, we can fix it." Daniel looked out over the river, watching the current move without concern. "You already fixed it," he said. "A long time ago." He ended the call before Victor could speak again. The following week, Victor resigned. The announcement was framed as a personal decision, a desire to spend more time with family, a chance to pursue new interests. The language was smooth, practiced, and hollow. The market reacted cautiously. Invitations stopped coming. Friends became harder to reach. The woman who was not his wife stopped answering messages. Daniel read the announcement. In the same quiet library where he had first studied the city's names, he folded the paper and returned it to its place, his expression unchanged. One life had shifted, not shattered, but bent enough to feel unfamiliar. The message was clear, even if only one man understood it fully. This was not the end. It was the opening note, played softly to test the room. Others would feel the vibrations soon enough. For now, Daniel returned to his walks, his routines, his careful invisibility. The city adjusted to Victor's absence without protest, just as it had adjusted to Daniel's disappearance years before. But somewhere, beneath its calm surface, a quiet understanding began to form. Things that were buried did not always stay buried. Sometimes, they waited for the right pressure to rise again. The city reacted to Victor's disappearance from public life the way cities always did, with brief curiosity followed by acceptance. Daniel counted on that. What mattered was not the headline or the explanation offered to the public, but the quiet shift among those who shared Victor's past. Messages were sent and not answered. Calls were returned later than usual. Dinners were canceled. Men who once spoke freely began to choose their words with care. Fear did not announce itself loudly. It arrived as hesitation. Daniel watched the hesitation spread. He did not rush. Escalation required contrast, and contrast required patience. He changed nothing about his routine, continuing his morning walks and late evenings, continuing to appear harmless and disconnected. At the gym, he lifted with control, never pushing to the point of attention. At the cafe, he ordered the same drink and tipped the same amount. Familiarity made him invisible. Invisibility made him dangerous. The next name on his mind was Eleanor Price, where Victor had hidden behind compliance, language, and corporate distance. Eleanor had hidden behind influence. She chaired boards, funded campaigns, and spoke about justice with the confidence of someone who believed the word belonged to her. Years ago, she had testified with certainty, her voice steady, her eyes sympathetic as she explained why Daniel's absence was necessary for the greater good. She had not lied outright. She had framed truth so carefully that it became unrecognizable. Daniel attended one of her public events without an invitation. The hall was bright and open, filled with people who believed proximity to power meant protection. Eleanor stood on stage, graceful and composed, answering questions that had been approved long before they were asked. Daniel stood near the back, listening, his posture relaxed. He did not look at her when she spoke about accountability. He listened for what she avoided instead. The shift began with her donors. Not all at once, and not in ways that could be traced to a single source. Old financial ties were reminded of forgotten obligations. Conflicts of interest, once ignored, resurfaced in conversations that carried just enough concern to demand review. Journalists received tips that required verification, and in verifying them, they found more than they expected. Eleanor's schedule grew tighter, her tone sharper. She smiled less between appearances. Daniel did not contact her directly. He understood her kind. Direct confrontation would only strengthen her resolve. Instead, he allowed her world to narrow slowly, as victors had, but with greater pressure. Invitations became conditional. Committees postponed decisions. Allies suggested rest, time away, quiet. Each suggestion sounded kind. Each one cut. One evening, Daniel sat in the back row of a charity gala, dressed appropriately, unnoticed. Eleanor entered to polite applause, her posture perfect, but her eyes scanned the room with an urgency she could not hide. When her gaze passed over Daniel, she did not recognize him, and that fact mattered more than recognition would have. He was not here to be seen. He was here to be felt. The first real fracture came when a junior associate, frightened and eager to survive, decided to cooperate with an inquiry. Names were mentioned carefully. Timelines were questioned. Eleanor's past statements were read back to her, not aggressively, but methodically, as if the truth itself were curious. She responded with practiced calm, but calm did not erase inconsistency. It only delayed its effect. Daniel followed the progress through indirect channels, never staying with one source long enough to leave a trace. He learned that Eleanor had begun sleeping poorly, that she drank more water during meetings, that she asked the same questions repeatedly, as if repetition might produce reassurance. These details did not please him. They confirmed him. The escalation reached its turning point on a quiet afternoon when Eleanor's foundation announced a temporary suspension of operations pending review. The language was careful, respectful, and devastating. It implied responsibility without assigning blame. It invited patience while eroding trust. Within hours, calls flooded her office, not from enemies, but from friends seeking distance. Daniel read the announcement alone, standing beneath an overpass as traffic roared above him. The noise wrapped around him, familiar and grounding. He thought of the courtroom, of Eleanor's steady voice explaining necessity, of the way she had avoided his eyes. He felt no anger now, only alignment. Events were moving as they should. That night, the phone vibrated again. This time, Daniel answered after the second ring. "You're making a mistake," Eleanor said, her voice controlled but tight. "Whatever you think this will give you, it won't." Daniel listened, letting the silence stretch. "You always believed outcomes were yours to decide," he said. "That's the mistake. We can talk," she insisted. "We can correct this." "There's nothing to correct," Daniel replied. "Only balance." He ended the call gently, as if closing a book. By the end of the month, Eleanor stepped down from her positions, citing health concerns and a desire for privacy. The city responded with sympathy. Flowers were sent. Articles praised her legacy. Daniel expected this. Public memory favored comfort over accuracy. What mattered was not what was said, but what was lost. Influence, once gone, did not return easily. 2 lives had been altered now, not destroyed, but stripped of certainty. The remaining names on Daniel's list felt the pressure even without knowing its source. They moved cautiously, spoke carefully, and slept less soundly. The escalation had done its work. The room had been tested. The audience was listening. Daniel returned to his small room that night and stood by the window, looking at the blank wall across from him. The calm he had offered the city was still in place, but beneath it, tension hummed, quiet and persistent. The final reckoning would not be loud. It would not be rushed. It would be exact. The last man had always believed himself untouchable. Marcus Reed did not hide behind boards or committees. He hid behind authority. He had been the face of the case, the one whose voice carried weight, whose certainty settled doubts before they could grow. Years ago, he had stood before cameras and spoken about order, about safety, about the importance of decisive action. He had said Daniel's name clearly, carefully, and then erased it with the same calm precision. Promotions followed. Respect followed. Silence followed. Marcus now lived in a house that sat back from the road, guarded by hedges and distance. His days were structured, predictable, designed to reassure him that control had never left his hands. Daniel learned those patterns quickly, not by watching the house, but by understanding the man. Control created repetition. Repetition created openings. Daniel chose the timing carefully. Not during a crisis, not during celebration, but during comfort. On a quiet morning, Marcus arrived at his office to find a request waiting on his desk. Formal and unavoidable. A review, limited in scope, standard procedure. Nothing alarming. Marcus smiled as he signed the acknowledgement, confident in his past decisions and the protection they had always provided. By afternoon, that confidence began to thin. Files were requested that had not been opened in years. Statements were compared, not aggressively, but thoroughly. Dates were aligned. Testimonies were revisited with fresh eyes that had no loyalty to old narratives. Marcus responded, as he always had, with certainty, with authority, with the assumption that his words still closed doors. It did not. Daniel did not push from the shadows this time. He stepped into the light, not publicly, but directly. The meeting was arranged through official channels, unavoidable and contained. When Marcus entered the room and saw Daniel seated at the table, older, quieter, unmistakably present, the air shifted. For the first time, Marcus hesitated. "This is inappropriate," Marcus said, his voice firm, reaching for control out of habit. Daniel met his eyes without challenge or fear. "So was what you did," he replied. The room was silent, sealed against interruption. Daniel spoke without anger, without accusation, laying facts down with careful order. Timelines, decisions, omissions, not opinions, evidence. Each point was precise, each connection clear. Marcus attempted interruption once, then stopped when he realized it only sharpened the focus. "You ruined your own record," Daniel said evenly. "I just brought it back into view." Marcus leaned back, his certainty cracking under the weight of documentation he could no longer dismiss. He saw, then, what had been done to the others, how quietly it had unfolded, how completely. He understood that this was not an attack, it was exposure. "You don't win anything from this," Marcus said, the confidence draining from his tone. "It won't give you back what you lost." Daniel considered him for a moment. "I'm not here to win," he said. "I'm here to finish." The review concluded without drama. No shouting, no spectacle, just findings recorded with clinical accuracy. Within weeks, Marcus was placed on leave, then removed. The announcement was brief, respectful, and final. The city absorbed it without protest, just as it had absorbed everything else. Order was preserved. Truth was corrected quietly. Daniel did not attend the press conference. He did not watch the coverage. He stood instead at the edge of the city, where the noise softened and the air moved freely. For the first time since his return, he allowed himself to stop walking. The revenge had not been loud. It had not been violent. It had not required him to become something he despised. It had been exact, measured, and complete. Each person who had participated in the destruction of his family now lived with the same uncertainty they had once assigned to him. That was the balance. Daniel left the city the next morning, carrying the same small bag he had arrived with, lighter now in ways that could not be measured. The gates did not close behind him this time. The road opened, quiet and unremarkable, and he walked it without looking back. Somewhere behind him, men slept less easily, reputations lay fractured, and certainty had become fragile. The city would never connect the events. It did not need to. What mattered was that the debt had been paid in full, and nothing unfinished followed him forward.